Welcome to On Work and Revolution, where we talk about what's shaking up in the world of work and EdTech. I'm your host, Debbie Goodman, and today we have as our guest, Deeps Ramanathan, who is the CMO of Degreed and Learn-In, a global marketing executive, board member, and startup advisor. Now, if you're in the EdTech ecosystem in the US, it's highly unlikely that you haven't heard of Degreed. But just in case, I'm here for the PSA announcement. Degreed is a leading online learning platform offering a really extensive array of educational resources, which are personalized, flexible, curated to the individual and the company, and have made a real impact in the workplace learning space in the US and globally. Deep started out as an engineer, but over his career, he transitioned to the dark side. He became a marketer and startup founder. Counterbalanced to the startup world, he's also built and led marketing teams in the US, Asia Pacific, and Europe for Google, IBM, and Twitter. So he's got this interesting mix of YC-backed edtech startup and then the biggest of the big tech companies out there. Deeps has an MBA majoring in marketing and strategy and a master's of engineering. He's originally from Australia and has a love of cricket and rugby. For those of you who don't know, Australia and South Africa, which is my home country, are arch rivals in both of these sports. So Deeps, I'm really glad we didn't get into that on our prep call. But what we did get into, and what we'll be talking about today, is the challenge of spotting exceptional people with the spark and the magic to significantly impact your company and who don't necessarily fit the job brief or the job description, and who you, meaning an employer or hiring company, might be missing out on. The from left field candidates who you might not even be getting to see. So welcome, Deeps.
Great to be here, Debbie. Thank you for having us.
Let's talk a little bit about Degreed and what its unique vision and philosophy is about people and learning.
Well, Degreed was born at a time when organizations and individuals looked at learning as the development that you have through formal education primarily, right? We're talking 11, 12, 15 years, 13 years ago. When you think about how much we have transformed, not just as individuals, but also through the technologies that we use every day, what you realize is that learning is core to pretty much everything that we do, right? We access new recipes on a weekly basis, right? To make something new and different. We learn about, we are able to move from learning language A and language B, language C, all within weeks. If we're not interested in something, we can move from learning something today to something completely different tomorrow that no previous generation has been able to do. And technology has been the real enabler for that. So I say all that because the core mission of Degreed is founded on this notion of needing to jailbreak the degree. Jailbreaking the degree is really not about saying that having a degree is bad. It's really about saying, why do we, when you ask someone what their educational qualifications are, even 20 years or 30 years of working, you go back to, I have an MBA and master's, and right? Because that's a period of time that's, formal education is equivalent to education and your skills and your learning and your development. Whereas when you jailbreak the degree, what we're actually saying is all skills and experiences that you have throughout your career, whether you are listening to this podcast and learning something new from this podcast, should be recognized irrespective of the method that you learn from, right? I could be with a friend in the kitchen, and we actually did that over the weekend. A friend came over and we made pasta together, and I learned new ways of making pasta. Now I learned a new skill and I actually applied that skill, but I'm not, not that I'll become a chef in the future, but it is an interesting thing where I can build these skills yet not be recognized for that. And so Degreed's ultimate mission is really to be able to help everyone get the recognition they deserve for the skills that they build outside of those times when you have those 2 to 4 year sort of degrees.
Just on that, I mean, so Jackhammer, we're an executive search firm. We take a look at people's career paths and trajectories for them to get to their sort of executive or leadership level roles. And at one point, I was looking at tracking some data on the correlation between the degree that people have and the work that they end up doing. And there's almost like no correlation, frankly. I mean, I look at myself or you. I have a law degree. I have never worked a day as a lawyer, but people still look at that as some kind of assessment credential on who I am and how I operate in the world, which is madness, quite frankly.
I 100% agree with you. If you introduced me as, an engineer, but I probably spent, less than a year doing anything related to technology engineering. I quickly figured out that my strength was talking about the technology instead of actually building the technology. And so that became a, self-recognition, self-reflection, and I found it through following those interests. I think what companies have the opportunity to do is when you look at not only building the talent pipeline, you also need to look at the way in which talent needs to transform inside the organization as well. How a lot of organizations that traditionally look at roles and job career paths and competencies that you follow. And I think in certain industries, that's a necessity, right? You need to have certain qualifications. Maybe it's a heavy technical industry, maybe there's some parts. But a lot of industries, you may find talent at different stages in their own career and development, but also throughout the organization that may be willing to try something different, new, yet you're not able to understand whether or not that individual, for example, shows interest, is interested, or give them an opportunity to put their hand up and say, hey, I'm working sort of in a product team, but I'm really interested in being in sales. How can I find my way into the sales organization? So, and that's where the real talent pipeline, I think, for me, starts to formulate and build, and organizations need to be thinking more about that.
There's a massive conversation happening now around internal mobility, and because of the skills shortage, and certainly in the US, the fact that there are fewer and fewer accessible resources from a talent perspective. Granted, there are a lot of layoffs now in the tech industry specifically, but that's a snapshot in time and still a small, tiny minority of the total working population. And we know that internal mobility, training and upskilling is a key strategy for organizations to retain employees. But let's switch the conversation to the other very interesting one we were having the other day, which is, so on the one hand, Degree and other companies in the workplace learning space, they exist to help employees to grow, develop, fulfill their potential, acquire new skills, be acknowledged and accredited for those skills so that there's some kind of verification that they've acquired certain skills and capabilities, and can therefore impact the employer or some other new employer. But what about the top of the funnel? The spotting of those exceptional, magical people, the talent, and the disservice that many companies do for themselves in the filtering process, the screening out of talent, because they look at what does success look like too narrowly. So you had an interesting story about somebody that you were interviewing, or an anecdote that was really depicted this situation.
People call it non-traditional candidates. I just call it candidates. You have candidates for a job. And the way in which we're starting to see a lot more companies start to remove certain requirements. For example, degree requirements, or, I need X number of years for someone to be experienced to take on this role. The effect of that is it widens the pool, right? Casts a wider net. But you need to be able to think about, why you're actually making these changes. And those changes are really about three things. One is we can find talent in many different places, but also with many different backgrounds, and that diversity is really important to bring into organizations. And we can't underestimate the value of opening up the net, casting a wider net so we can bring that pull in. The second thing that's interesting is when you cast the wider net, you will find unique skill sets that you won't find through those traditional channels. And, I remember, it's sort of two halves of my life at Google. I spent 9 years at Google, and I still remember the first 4 years, we had very stringent hiring practices around not just degree qualifications, but we would rank and rate the university that they went to. And based and with an extremely high bar. And so based on the university, not the program, not the course, not the bachelor's degree, but the university itself, we would make a decision that this person is, potentially going to be a top performer, a superstar versus not. Firstly, I think in this world, those judgments really don't fly when you think about people making their way, uh, you know, based on their own strengths rather than having, that experience just because they had the chance to go to a top university. And so what we found was, as Google transformed its business towards doing more things around new areas, for example, building phones or building hardware, we found that the pool of candidates, two things were happening. One, we were coming across the same pool of people over and over again, applying for different jobs across the company. But the second thing that happened was we just couldn't find the skills for the new types of strategic initiatives that the business was moving into. And so then you have this challenge where, what do you do? How do you shift? As an executive team, the call was made to be able to bring in, not look at the degree requirement as a stringent requirement. We basically removed the degree requirement as being for a lot of roles and made it more focused on the skill sets that people have had, built over their career. And so we would find great people, great talent who would work 30 years in a particular, in machining, for example, because we needed that type of skill set to join the workforce at Google. Traditionally, we wouldn't have even been able to get access to those individuals. So it opened up the pool of candidates. It also made the company much more effective and diverse because third point, you end up having many different ideas circulating inside the company from different places that actually makes the company much more successful. That second 4 years at Google was when Google really grew rapidly and accelerated. And I'd put a lot of that down to opening up, casting that wider net.
That's a perfect, amazing case study for the transition that you're speaking about, like dropping unnecessary requirements, because they really aren't necessarily a measure of any kind of success other than very specifically. And it's all very well to look at that and say, well, that's a great example. What was it like from a mindset change? Because you had all of these hiring managers who'd been used to having this measure of this credential that was one indicator as to whether they should include somebody even in the interview process, and kind of hanging on to that. I see this all the time. I see companies that brief with us, and the first requirement on the shopping list of requirements is the degree requirement that has almost no bearing on why. I often have to ask them, why does this person need to have this degree? And they often don't give me very good reasons for it. I sometimes think it's because, let's say, for example, they have that type of degree and they rate themselves as being very smart, accomplished, and successful. They think that only other people who also have that kind of degree will be able to be successful too. But what was it like from a mindset change perspective within Google at that time, when all of a sudden this thing that had been so important was now like, okay, that's not important anymore?
There's a cultural side of this, right? Which is you get into Google and you feel like, you're someone special, I'll be honest with you. And it strokes the ego. And a lot of people have, this feeling that they are top of the world when they join Google. The issue with that is exactly what you said, which is you try to find people who went to the same alumni, right? The same group of people. You bump into the same people over and over again. You try to bring people that your connections are very tight based on the schools you went to. So, kind of that sort of brings in the same types of people. And we had to transform the entire process of the evaluation process during interviews. So what we did was, and it took us some time to actually recognize that not only changing the requirements to get into the door and actually applying was important, but you need to change the process. We used at least 7, 8, 9 interviews at Google. As painful as that is as a candidate, it's also unfair. It's unfair again, from our accessibility, and there's an inequity side to that. So we maxed interviews out to 4. And so basically it was 4 interviews. And if we can't find answers in 4 interviews, we're not asking the right questions. So let's go and re-look at the questions we're asking and make sure we shift the questions appropriately to the candidate, right? It's not about maybe your qualification as much as, your skills and your experiences and speak more to the skill sets that you've gained over those years of working. So there's a real mindset shift, but I think the process and systems need to shift first to be able to have the mindsets change over time. It's a closed group, and so the mindsets stay the same, and you end up not being able to sort of activate this new way of thinking. And you even think about, a small story here. I remember going through interviewing for a particular role. It was a product marketing manager role, and I had someone with a completely different background who actually hadn't graduated but had built their own company and had started to build a company. Someone very earlier in their career, but they was just so motivated. And during the interview, my initial impression was, maybe they haven't got enough experience to join. They had worked in their own company for 3-4 years. They hadn't worked elsewhere. It was basically a garage sort of startup that they'd created. But then as I went through the interview, what I realized was the individual had to sell for themselves, right? A whole bunch of skills around selling. They had to figure out how to actually package and price and develop the product. They had to understand, what motivated customers, what brought them into being able to sell this product. So while they didn't have any formal training, they didn't understand maybe all the strategic frameworks about all the things that we learn at school. What they did understand was real life experience in doing the work. We ended up hiring an individual, and obviously, she performed extremely well. But the truth is, it takes a minute to really undo your own thinking, and actually help yourself look at things from a different point of view, and then try to activate that across the business.
I can, certainly add to that countless examples of candidates that we managed to get through the initial filtering process almost like by a stroke of luck, because their credentials didn't necessarily tick all the boxes. And so when our teams are out there scouring the markets for great talent, they are trying to look for certain markers around key requirements. Are they likely to have the skills and capabilities to do a job? And what then happens is you are not necessarily looking for the ancillary magic, the talent, the spark. You're looking for ticking a few boxes. And so you're naturally going to only see people who have sort of minimum key requirements. And so it's less likely that you're going to, even at the top of the funnel, have access to this potential talent that doesn't have the bare minimum key criteria. And I'm always wondering, just for efficiency purposes, it's kind of no way to open up any interview process or any screening process entirely. It's just too unwieldy. And so there has to be some guardrails. Unfortunately, that does mean that there are going to be some incredible people who are just never going to get in the door. And that's kind of heartbreaking at times to think about who the gatekeepers are. And it is the gatekeepers who, for one reason or another, will keep things either very open or a little ajar or entirely closed. We know that the frontline people who are the very overworked talent managers who are doing this initial filtering, they just don't have the time or capacity to do anything other than look for hitting the beats, those key criteria. And so it takes almost like a stroke of luck sometimes that to bring somebody who comes from left field into the process. When I used to interview for our company, we often would take people with no recruiting experience whatsoever, because that was, we couldn't actually recruit people from our competitors because of non-competes. And so the thing that I would look for was, I wanted to look for people who had this passion and talent for something else that they'd had to apply discipline to and rigor to, combined with just their excitement about it. And so it was usually somebody who had some esoteric hobby and goodness knows what. And it was a pretty good good enough measure of success. Are there any examples that you've had of somehow through great luck being able to get somebody from left field into your orbit? Because I think there are listeners who are so frustrated at not being able to get their foot in the door somewhere.
I was listening the other day about, there's big tools that use AI, essentially some sort of matching exercise where they find keywords and they match and they push candidates through. And we know all the platforms there. But what's interesting about that is someone said in this conversation that was happening, years ago there used to be the advice is make your resume stand out, make it look different, maybe print it in a different font or do something unique on the page. But it's fascinating now that the advice is, in fact, do not do that, because the technology won't make sense of what you're presenting. So make it very standard and make it, what everyone else looks like. So even that just tells you, like, we're managing for efficiency and systems, and not managing for the finding the magic or the outliers within that pool of candidates. And it's hard because like you said, bandwidth and people. I have had one story that I think is really interesting. I was at Twitter and we were looking for someone to take on a creative role on the team. So someone who can, a designer essentially, to join the marketing team. We had been trying to find the right candidate, just skill sets wise, and a mix of business and consumer background. It was an interesting role, and out of left field. And I typically don't do this, but I was at a meetup event. And literally, it was a marketing meetup. It wasn't designers, it wasn't anything. But this person had basically figured that going to this marketing meetup, which is outside of my particular skill domain, would be interesting just to see who's there and have conversations and start to learn more about marketing and all these things. So anyway, I met this person there, and we gave details, and then a week later I interviewed her, and a month or so later we ended up hiring her to take on this designer role. Left field for two reasons. One, the person went into a different field and just put herself out there, right? She was looking for a new role. She wanted to explore. She met new people. So I do think there's a role, even now when everything's remote, to actually now start to even use forums like conferences and meetups and other channels to really try to introduce yourself and meet, the face-to-face, still meeting people, making connections. Nothing, almost, we have to do more of that now to be able to find the right talent that we previously, because the tools that we're using, like we said, they're built for scale, right? They're not built for actually, true finding individuals and finding the needle in the haystack, right? As we would say.
Yeah, it's for just gathering hay, not to discredit anybody. But yes, they are efficiency tools. They work to a certain degree. But if I were to say to anybody who's listening and is at that point of going, okay, I really want to either make a career change, or I want to get into a new area, or I'm just struggling to get in the door, continuing to just send your resume to companies and be in the pile of resumes that needs to be screened by some AI bot is not the answer here. It's to do things differently. It's to get in person at meetups. It's to get onto webinars. It's to network vigorously. It's to leverage everything outside of the traditional way of sending a resume in order to connect with people, so that people can actually, so that interviewers, hiring managers, people in organizations can get a sense of who you are. Because that's really what we're saying, is how do you get a sense of who a person is beyond the resume? In order that we can diversify and think differently about the kind of talent we want to bring in.
It's not too dissimilar to internal mobility, right? Like, if you think about it, inside a company, if you put yourself out there, you talk to different managers, you talk to different people in different teams, more often than not, they remember you when a role comes up, or they may actually create a role because they know you. And we can't do that well externally, but I actually believe we can now. But you just need to be patient, right? You need to realize that this could take a year, it could take some time, but you're more than likely to find something that you're really excited about and interested in by taking these steps that you're suggesting here, Debbie.
I think since people are working hybrid or remote, certainly that networking cross-functionally, the incidental interactions of meeting people at a physical space, those have diminished. We've seen that one of the disadvantages of remote and hybrid work is that ability to engage outside of your own immediate team, and that has been disadvantageous to people who are wanting to move internally. But I think, there are certainly organizations who've started to figure out ways for people to do that even when they are remote or working in distributed teams, and people really need to take advantage of that. It's effort, it's showing up, it's, as you say, patience, but those opportunities do exist. And hopefully, I'm just hoping that more and more leaders, the hiring managers, apply this mindset that you have, probably because you've made these kinds of interesting career transitions yourself, where people shouldn't need to stay in boxes and lanes for their entire lives and careers. Most don't. And how are we going to leverage like the full extent of people's capabilities and skills and talents? Particularly now, we're entering this new era of augmented by AI that's right on our doorstep, and things are going to be changing rapidly. So we could have a whole different session talking about that, which maybe we should schedule at some time.
Absolutely. I call it ARIA, actually, the phase that we're in. Automation, robotics, Internet of Things, and AI. And it's a good way to remember, like, all of those pieces are going to dramatically affect pretty much every job that's out there, every task that we have to do. So what you're suggesting is just go back to being people, right? Let's meet, let's talk.
Let's embrace our humanity while we still can.
Absolutely, while we still can. If you look at the engagement stats, not to bring a downer into it, but if you look at the engagement stats when we move to fully remote or hybrid work, the employee engagement. There's a recent poll by Gallup, right? Only 32% of people are actually engaged, right? Fully engaged in their work. And there are actually about 17% that are actively disengaged. So you're talking about a fifth of a company that are actively disengaged. You're talking another 50% that are somewhere in the middle. Maybe some days are better than others. And then there's only about 30% of your company. So the internal mobility piece isn't just about finding talent, improving productivity or performance, or it's also about engagement, right? It's also being able to say, look, we have paths for growth. We'll give you meaningful development and feedback. And we have mechanisms for you not to have to look elsewhere, but to stay engaged inside of the business. One of the things that when Degreed first launched, the first function that Degreed created was called the lifelong learning profile. And it still exists, and it's still in use by over 10 million of our users. And essentially, the lifelong learning profile is a place where you have all of the skills and experiences captured on your page. So if you think about the future, right, we have your resume or your CV, your LinkedIn profile, and then your skills profile. And so Degreed would be the place where you would find your skills, all the skills that you've developed over time. Why that is important is when you think about internal mobility and possibly transferring that profile to other companies, companies can then look at, hey, this individual, going back to that initial conversation, has a set of skills, and let's actually do skills-based hiring. Let's actually look at people from a skills perspective. We have XYZ project coming up. Who can I find inside my org that can fit the skill sets that we need for that project or initiative? Companies, the changes that we're all going through, as the world has gone through over the last few years, is putting so much pressure on companies. And then you add this, what I call ARIA, as I mentioned earlier, you add that into it, and you realize that the change, we cannot keep pace with technological changes, but what we can do is change the practices internally around looking at skills as the currency, rather than looking at defined job roles and hierarchies and some of the old ways that we used to think. And so going back to your point around, how do we keep up with all these changes? I think we need to really adapt the organization just to adjust for it.
Well, I think we probably have a sequel to this conversation coming up.
We do. There's so much to talk about.
And certainly the AI piece is right on our doorstep right now. Every single conversation I'm having is like, what is that going to mean for me, for jobs, for learning, for etc. So part 2. But for now, thank you so much, Deeps. That's been a fascinating time with you. Thank you for being here, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye now.
Thanks, Debbie. Appreciate it.
Thanks for hanging around all the way to the end. It would mean the world if you would rate and review on Work and Revolution on your favorite listening app. It helps people know that the show is worth listening to, and so I'll really appreciate that. Thank you so much.